The night shift at Oak Creek Memorial in Houston started the same way it always did, fluorescent lights humming like generators in a distant bunker, the smell of antiseptic so thick it coated the back of Margaret Walsh's throat, and the quiet understanding that nobody here would ever ask her name. She moved through the corridors with her shoulders rounded inward, her grey hair pulled back in a practical knot, her scrubs hanging loose on a frame that had learned long ago how to make itself smaller. 11 months. That's how long she'd been walking these halls, pushing gurneys, checking vitals, speaking only when spoken to. The other nurses called her the quiet one when they called her anything at all. They didn't know that the hands moving with such deliberate precision through patient assessments had once held arterial bleeders shut in the dark. They didn't know that the slight limp in her left leg came from shrapnel that still occasionally caught on cold mornings. They didn't know what she'd walked away from. Margaret had served as Senior Chief Petty Officer in the Navy Medical Corps for 23 years and 4 months. She'd trained combat medics in Tikrit during 5 consecutive deployments. She'd pioneered battlefield cardiology protocols that would later save over 300 lives in combat zones across the Middle East. She'd stood in forward operating bases while shells landed close enough to shake the walls, and she'd never trembled once. Then something broke in Tikrit that wouldn't heal, not the kind of break you could see on an X-ray, but the kind that lived in the quiet moments at 3 in the morning when her late husband Tom's voice wouldn't come back no matter how hard she tried to remember it. So she'd walked away. She'd resigned her commission, collected her pension, and taken this job in Houston where nobody knew her rank, her history, or the fact that she was running from the only life that had ever made sense. The job was simple: keep your head down, help the patients, don't make waves. Tom would have understood. Tom had always understood. The ambulance arrived at 11:11 p.m., and everything changed. The paramedics wheeled in an unconscious male, approximately 30 years old, combat fatigue soaked with dried blood, no identification papers. His left shoulder bore a visible bullet entry wound, and his breathing was shallow but present. The usual chaos followed, nurses calling out vitals, the stretcher wheels squeaking across tile like something wounded, the intercom crackling with someone shouting orders from the desk. Margaret was in Bay 4, finishing paperwork on a discharged patient, when she heard the commotion and moved toward the sound. She didn't rush. She never rushed anymore. That was the old Margaret, the one who'd moved like an apex predator through trauma scenes, the one who could read a bleeding soldier in 3 seconds and know exactly what would keep him alive. This Margaret moved like someone carrying weight that nobody else could see. The patient was being transferred to the gurney when she arrived. An attending physician, not Dr. Hargrove, thank God, but a younger resident named Chen, was already calling for labs, imaging, and a surgical consult. Margaret began cataloguing the belongings that had arrived with him, placing each item into a clear plastic hospital bag with the same care she'd once used with classified equipment in war zones. Wallet, empty. Phone, shattered screen, no emergency contacts visible. Then she reached for the boots. They were issued military issue, tan leather worn soft from desert heat, the laces still tied in that particular way that soldiers tied them before a mission. They were Ranger boots. She could tell from the cut, the specific weathering pattern, the way the sole had been reinforced. These were boots that had walked through Kandahar, through Marja, through places that existed in the files and not on any map. Her hand steadied as she placed them in the bag. The last item was the medal. It was clutched so tightly in the ranger's unconscious hand that the paramedics had to carefully pry his fingers open. Margaret saw it and felt her entire body go very still. A Tikrit deployment ribbon. Not the standard kind. This was the variant issued only to personnel stationed at the specific forward operating base where she'd served, the one where 12 of her medics had died in a single IED attack in March of 2015. She knew that ribbon the way she knew her own heartbeat. She knew exactly which units had been stationed there, which operations they'd run, which casualties had come through the aid station at 0300 hours when the night shift was her responsibility, and her hands had been steady as surgical lasers while everything inside her fell apart. "Hey, you good?" A voice cut through her focus. One of the Ranger's fellow soldiers had come in with him, must have been on the same transport. He was standing near the bay entrance, his own uniform stained, his eyes locked on the medal in Margaret's hands. His expression shifted when he looked at her, something like recognition flickering across his face. "You got those hands. How are you handling that medal like you know what it means? Where do you serve?" Margaret didn't answer immediately. She placed the medal into the plastic bag with the same precision she'd use for evidence, and she turned to face the soldier directly. Her voice when it came was barely above a whisper, the way she'd trained herself to speak in this civilian life. "I'll make sure this stays with him." "That's not what I asked." The ranger's eyes didn't leave her face. "That's a Kandahar cut on your forearm. I saw it when you reached for the boots. You don't get that kind of scar unless you were in the shit. Where were you deployed?" She could have lied. She could have deflected. She could have let her shoulders round inward the way they always did and disappeared into the background of fluorescent lights and beeping monitors. But something in his voice, the respect in it, the recognition, the way he was looking at her like she was something other than invisible, made her pause. The moment lasted exactly 2 seconds before Dr. Hargrove walked into the bay, and whatever had opened inside her snapped shut again. Dr. Pierce Hargrove was 39 years old, had attended Harvard Medical School on a legacy admission, and had spent the last 11 months making Margaret Walsh's life a study in systematic degradation. He was the kind of man who looked at women like her, quiet, grey-haired, competent in ways that didn't demand acknowledgement, and saw only opportunity. His family had money. His network had connections. His arrogance had footnotes. He walked into the trauma bay with the confidence of someone who had never once been told no by anyone who mattered, and he glanced at Margaret with the kind of dismissal you'd give to medical equipment that had started malfunctioning. "Walsh, you need to step back from the patient." His tone was conversational, which made it worse. "Let the actual clinicians handle this one. Check his belongings for insurance information, would you? And then see if someone needs their vitals retaken in the waiting room. That's more your speed." Margaret placed the plastic bag containing the medal and the boots on the side table. Her hands didn't shake. Her jaw didn't clench visibly. She simply nodded and turned toward the exit, and that's when the second ranger spoke up. "Actually, Doc, this is—" He stopped, glancing at Margaret, something like apology crossing his face. Whatever he'd been about to say died before it reached his voice. "This is what?" Hargrove didn't even look up from the patient's chart. "This is your moment to give me unsolicited input? This is your time to question my clinical decisions? I'm going to need you to move down the hallway. Now." Margaret kept walking. She didn't look back. She didn't acknowledge the frustration in the ranger's eyes or the questions hanging in the air like smoke. She had learned, over 11 months, that the best way to survive was to be the kind of person nobody remembered. The kind of nurse who faded into walls, who anticipating needs without asking, who existed in the spaces between moments and made herself so small that even attention couldn't quite find her. She had gotten very good at disappearing. But something had shifted when she'd seen that Tikrit ribbon. Something had shifted when that soldier had asked where she'd served, when he'd recognized the scar on her arm like it was a language he understood. For the first time in 11 months, she'd felt the weight of what she was carrying start to press down on her shoulders. The medal was still in that bag. The boots were still waiting. And somewhere in this hospital, an Army Ranger was going to wake up, if he woke up at all, with no memory of how he got here and no one to tell him that the woman who'd cleaned his wounds with hands that had done it 1,000 times before was standing just outside his door. Margaret made it as far as the medication station before the intercom crackled to life. "Code Blue, Trauma Bay 4. I need the crash cart now. Cardiac tamponade, possible pneumothorax. Move, people." The next voice she heard was Hargrove's, already shouting orders, already demanding equipment with the tone of a man who believed his confidence was the same thing as competence. Margaret's hands were already moving toward her station before her brain caught up, muscle memory from 23 years in operating theaters and forward aid stations, from moments when speed was the difference between a soldier going home and a flag-folded ceremony. She grabbed the crash cart and turned back toward the bay, and that's when she caught sight of the ranger's belongings still sitting on the side table, the medal catching the overhead light, the boots standing guard like sentries at a post that would never know peace again. The quietest person in the room was about to become the only one who could save a life. The crash cart wheels squeaked against the linoleum as Margaret pushed through the double doors, and the fluorescent lights hummed their constant mechanical prayer above her head. She could already feel the shift in the air, that electric tension that arrived whenever a body was failing faster than medicine could rebuild it. The ranger's monitor beeped its anxious rhythm. 140 beats per minute. Too fast. Wrong fast. The kind of fast that meant something fundamental had broken inside his chest. She moved to his bedside and her hands found the stethoscope without conscious thought, muscle memory from 23 years of watching bodies betray their owners. The chest sounds were muffled, distant, as if someone had wrapped his lungs in wool. His neck veins distended like dark roads leading nowhere. She felt his pulse and found it thready, his skin cool despite the blanket. Blood pressure 70/40. The numbers were screaming what her ears already knew. Cardiac tamponade. Blood pooling in the space around his heart, suffocating the chambers with every squeeze, drowning him from the inside. She'd watched this happen twice before. Once in a field hospital 17 kilometers southwest of Tikrit, where a helicopter rotor had caught shrapnel and turned a Marine's thorax into a puzzle no surgeon could solve in time. Once in a makeshift clinic in Anbar province, where she'd had 30 seconds and a 19-gauge needle and hand steady as surgical steel. That patient had lived. She'd held his hand afterward while rain hammered the canvas tent like applause for the miracle they'd just pulled off together. Margaret reached for the intercom, her voice level as concrete. Paging surgical team. Trauma Bay 3. Patient is coding. She started pushing fluids, elevated his legs, kept her movements precise and automatic because panic was a luxury that dead men couldn't afford. Torres arrived first, the former army medic who'd been dozing in the waiting area. He took one look at the monitor and his face went pale. Jesus Christ! That's tamponade. His words came out as a whisper, as if speaking louder might make it more real. Get me a pericardiocentesis kit, Margaret said quietly. She was already positioning the patient, already mapping the approach in her mind, subxiphoid, 45-degree angle toward the left shoulder, the exact technique they drilled into her during combat trauma certification courses that had since been classified. Torres froze. His hand stopped moving. That's a physician procedure. You can't, his voice cracked like a boy's. Then get me a physician. Fast. Margaret's tone didn't change, but Torres heard something underneath it, something that sounded like a door closing on argument. The ranger's blood pressure dropped another 5 points. 70/40. Then 65/38. The monitor accelerated its panic beeping. Margaret grabbed the kit Torres had positioned on the tray, her fingers finding the needle with the certainty of someone who'd done this in darkness, in rain, in the middle of a war zone where the only light came from muzzle flashes and the burning certainty that this man's life was worth more than protocol. She felt the needle slide through skin and muscle, felt the resistance give way like a door unlocking. The pop as the needle entered the pericardial sac was subtle but unmistakable, a small sound that carried the weight of salvation. She withdrew the syringe and 60 milliliters of dark red blood came back, and the ranger's heart could finally breathe. His pressure climbed. 75. 82. 88. Stable. Torres was staring at her hands with something that looked like recognition colliding with shock. Where did you learn that approach? His voice had changed, no longer asking for permission to understand, but demanding explanation. That's a Kandahar cut. Field protocol, not civilian standard. He stepped closer, studying her face like a man trying to read a language he'd forgotten he'd ever known. Where did you serve? Margaret didn't answer. She simply adjusted the fall line, checked the ranger's peripheral pulses one more time, kept her voice and her breathing level. The door burst open and Dr. Hargrove appeared, fresh from surgery, his surgical mask still hanging around his neck like a noose he hadn't bothered to tie. His eyes found Margaret first, found her standing there with the empty syringe in her hand and the ranger's vital signs climbing back toward the land of living patients. Hargrove's face transformed. The color drained from it like someone had pulled a plug. His jaw tightened until his teeth looked sharp enough to draw blood. "What the hell do you think you're doing?" His voice came out low and lethal, the voice of a man whose entire world had just shifted sideways on its axis. "Saving his life," Margaret said quietly. She set the syringe down on the tray with the precision of someone laying down a weapon. Hargrove's eyes went cold in a way that made the temperature in the room plummet. "You just ended your career." His words came out like a sentence being read, final and irrevocable. He turned on his heel and walked out, and everyone in the room, Torres, the nurses, even the monitors, seemed to hold their breath in the silence he left behind. Margaret turned back to her patient. She checked his chest tube output, verified the 4 lines, documented the vital signs in a steady hand that didn't shake and wouldn't shake, no matter what happened next. That was when she noticed the other ranger, the one who'd been sitting vigil in the corner chair all night, the soldier who'd been searching for his friend since the explosion that had left him unconscious and alone. He was standing now, his hands clenched into fists at his sides, and his eyes were fixed on Margaret with an expression that looked like someone watching a ghost step out of a photograph. He moved toward her slowly, his uniform creased and worn, his boots scarred from 1,000 miles of running toward trouble. He said, and his voice came out rough as gravel. "Those scars on your hands. That technique. The way you moved." He swallowed hard. "Where did you serve?" Margaret continued monitoring the ranger's vitals, her voice steady as stone. "Just a nurse tonight. That's all anyone needs to know." But her hands moved across the equipment with the fluid precision of someone who'd kept people alive in places where living was a luxury measured in minutes and seconds. The ranger in the bed gasped a shallow breath, the first real breath he'd taken on his own in hours, and the monitors beeped their steady affirmation that he was still here, still fighting, still exactly where he needed to be. The clock on the wall read 0307 hours. Somewhere in the distance, a siren wailed through the Houston night. Margaret checked the 4 one more time, adjusted the monitor leads, and felt something settle in her chest that had been restless for 11 months, the knowledge that her hands still remembered what they were built to do, that muscle memory was just another name for muscle honor, and that sometimes the quietest person in the room was exactly where she needed to be when the world started breaking. The cardiac monitor flatlined. One long, unbroken scream of electrical silence. Dr. Hargrove's voice cut through the trauma bay like a blade. "Get that OR prepped. Move. Now." He turned away, already reaching for the phone, already composing the narrative in his head, another save, another feather, another story for the attendings' lounge. He didn't see Margaret move. Nobody did. One moment she was standing 3 feet from the stretcher. The next moment her hand was steady as a surgical laser, needle already in her grip, 14-gauge angiocath locked between her fingers like she'd been born holding it. The ranger's chest was caved inward, ribs like prison bars around a dying heart. Air in the pericardium. Fluid crushing the ventricles. Every heartbeat drowning in its own container. 40 seconds. That's all the body gives you before the brain starts switching off. Margaret didn't waste any of them. 2 ribs below the left nipple. She spoke to the resident standing frozen beside her, a young woman named Dr. Sue whose hands were trembling. Xiphoid process as landmark. Angle 45 degrees toward the left shoulder. Not a request. A sequence. A map. Dr. Sue moved without thinking, muscle memory obeying the voice of someone who'd never questioned their own orders. Margaret's left hand found the space, second intercostal space, midclavicular line, and the needle went in smooth as a syringe into warm butter. The hiss. That specific sound of pressurized air escaping, oxygen flooding back where it had no business being. 1 hiss. 2. 3. The monitor twitched. A blip. Then another. Then a rhythm. Sinus. Steady. The ranger's oxygen saturation climbed like a stone falling upward, 68, 74, 82, 88, each number a small miracle climbing the digital display. His blood pressure crawled from the dead 62/40, then 71/45, then up toward something that looked like life. Margaret didn't celebrate. She was already reaching for the drainage bag, already securing the catheter with sterile tape, already checking the 4 lines with the methodical precision of someone who had done this not once but hundreds of times, in desert tents, in helicopters, in the kind of darkness where the only light was coming from a dying man's monitor. Dr. Sue stood frozen, watching. "He's stabilizing," she whispered. "He's alive because you were here." Margaret met her eyes for exactly 1 second. "I'm going on break," she said quietly, and began peeling off her gloves. The resident's mouth opened. Closed. In that second, something shifted in the trauma bay. The attending doctors who had been standing useless in the corner suddenly realized they hadn't been the ones saving this life. The respiratory tech moving toward the patient, he'd been taking orders from Margaret, not from them. The nurse coordinator checking the ranger's vitals, she'd heard Margaret's voice and moved like a person hearing scripture. And then the doors opened. Dr. Hargrove walked back in, already knowing the patient was stable because the monitor had told him so, already composing his version of the story in which he directed the procedure, delegated wisely, ensured patient safety through proper supervision. He saw Margaret pulling off her second glove and something in his face changed. The temperature in the room dropped 12 degrees. His eyes narrowed. Not with gratitude. With something else. Something that looked like a man watching a card trick he didn't understand, and recognizing that he'd been the mark. "My office," he said. "Now." Not a request. An order. The kind delivered by someone whose power was suddenly feeling very fragile, very questioned, very exposed. Margaret followed him down the corridor, and the rain that had been hammering the windows since 0300 hours suddenly sounded louder, as if the sky itself was keeping score. The emergency meeting was scheduled for 0847. Dr. Hargrove had spent the hours between the ranger's stabilization and sunrise making calls. 3 calls. 3 favors from people whose names Margaret would never know but whose power she was about to feel like a fist closing around her throat. Dr. Patricia Chen, board member, ophthalmologist, married to a federal judge. Her son had done his residency under Hargrove's mentorship, and Hargrove had written letters that changed the trajectory of his career. A debt. Chen owed him a debt, and debts in medicine were currency. Robert Lansing, hospital counsel, thin-lipped, the kind of lawyer who counted words like they were expensive. Hargrove had testified in a malpractice suit 5 years ago, testimony that had saved Lansing's position and the hospital's accreditation. Another debt. Another person sitting in the mahogany conference room at the hospital's administrative wing, waiting to watch Margaret's career burn. And the third call had been to the state nursing board. An external investigator. A woman named Patricia Rothstein with the kind of voice that suggested she'd been born disappointed. She would review every procedure Margaret had touched in the last 11 months. Every 4. Every medication. Every breath she'd helped another nurse take. The investigation would be thorough. It would be meticulous. It would be, Hargrove had made clear, focused on establishing a pattern of scope violation that endangered patient safety and the hospital's institutional accreditation. Margaret sat across from them, hands folded in her lap, badge already removed and sitting on the table like an accusation. The nursing director, Rosa Martinez, was there too, a woman who had served 5 years in the Army Nurse Corps before civilian medicine, and whose eyes had widened when she watched Margaret save the ranger's life. Rosa asked her directly, "Did you perform the pericardiocentesis?" The room held its breath. "Yes," Margaret said quietly. The patient would have died otherwise. It wasn't defensive. It wasn't angry. It was the tone of someone reporting facts, the way a soldier reports coordinates or casualty counts. Just information. Just what happened. Dr. Hargrove leaned forward, and his voice came out smooth as oil on water. "That determination is not yours to make, Margaret. You're not a physician. You don't have the training, the licensing, or the authority to perform procedures of that caliber. Patient safety is our first concern. The hospital's accreditation is built on protocols, hierarchy, supervision. He paused. Let that word sit. Supervision. Like she was a child who'd colored outside the lines. You're suspended pending full investigation. You'll surrender your badge and keys immediately. You're not to enter this hospital in any capacity until this process is complete. Am I clear? Margaret nodded once. She stood. She walked out without another word, and the rain that had been drumming the windows all night suddenly sounded like applause for her exit, like the weather itself was mocking the proceedings. But Hargrove wasn't finished. He never was. He spent the next 12 hours making calls that Margaret didn't hear and never would have expected. Calls to her previous employer, a small clinic in rural Kansas where she'd worked for years prior under her married name, Margaret Donnelly, before Tom's death had sent her spiraling into invisibility. He dug into those files, pressuring the clinic director to reveal any previous violations, any complaints, any hint of scope creeping or insubordination. He reached out to the board members again, reinforcing the narrative. Patient safety. Institutional liability. The need for swift termination. He contacted the external investigator, Patricia Rothstein, and provided her with a carefully curated list of procedures, the foreplacements, the medication administrations, the moment in the trauma bay when a nurse had stepped outside her lane and into the role of a savior, which was exactly what institutional protocols existed to prevent. He was building a case the way a mason lays bricks. Methodical. Careful. Each piece supporting the next. He didn't know about the DD-214. He didn't know about the classified databases. He didn't know that Margaret Walsh's military service existed in files that required security clearances his investigator wouldn't have and his board members couldn't access. He didn't know that her 23 years of Navy service, the citations, the deployment records, the medals earned in places he couldn't even imagine, were sealed in a system far above his pay grade and his authority. What he saw was a nurse who had stepped outside her role, and he was going to destroy her for it. Margaret drove through Houston rain that fell like bullets on her windshield, her hand steady on the steering wheel, her jaw tight but not trembling. The cemetery gates were open at 0930 on a Thursday morning. Nobody else was there. The grass was sodden from 2 days of storms, and when she knelt at Tom's grave, mud soaked through her scrub pants, cold and invasive and real. She knelt there with her hands pressed into the earth, feeling the weight of her husband's body 6 feet below, feeling the weight of 11 months of invisibility, of pretending to be smaller than she was. Her voice came out barely above a whisper. I tried to disappear, Tom. I tried to be small and invisible and safe. I tried to live the way you wanted me to live, quiet, humble, just another nurse pushing a cart and following orders. The rain drummed against her back. Against the headstone. Against her shoulders, which didn't shake, wouldn't shake, couldn't shake because that wasn't how senior chief petty officers handled broken things. They just carried them. But I failed you again. I failed you the second I picked up that needle and became what I was supposed to forget how to be. She stayed there for 47 minutes. Stayed until her clothes were soaked through and her lips had gone pale from cold. Stayed because this was the conversation she'd been avoiding for 11 months, the reckoning between the woman Tom had married and the soldier he could never quite reach, between the life she'd tried to build and the life her hand still remembered. Her phone buzzed at 12:47. A text message from an unknown number. Then another. Then a call. Blocked number. The kind of call that comes from classified phones with restricted caller IDs, the kind that makes the air pressure change just by existing. Margaret stared at the phone screen like it was a door opening on a version of herself she'd spent 11 months trying to seal shut. She didn't answer. Not yet. But her hands had stopped being cold. She was still standing at Tom's grave when her phone rang a second time. The registered mail arrived at 0947 on a Tuesday morning, thick envelope bearing the Oak Creek Memorial Hospital seal and a signature line that required her fingerprint. Margaret set her coffee down on the kitchen table without tasting it. The termination letter was written in the clinical language of institutional protection, gross negligence, scope violation, patient safety risk, effective immediately, all severance contingent upon a non-disclosure agreement worth $847,000 if breached. She read it twice, folded it carefully along the crease, and set it next to her untouched cup. The coffee had gone cold already. 3 years of night shifts, 3 years of keeping her hand steady and her voice soft, and it had taken Hargrove exactly 48 hours to erase her with a registered letter. The external investigation had been fast-tracked. That was the phrase that cut deepest, fast-tracked, which meant phone calls had been made, favors collected, board connections leveraged. The investigation summary noted that the pericardiocentesis was performed without physician authorization, without proper procedure protocols, in a manner that constituted immediate and egregious breach of nursing scope of practice. The language was careful, technical, unassailable. Hargrove had built his case in methodical layers: the procedure itself, the lack of physician order, the intervention beyond her certification, the risk to institutional liability. Every layer was true. Every layer was also a lie, because the truth, that the Ranger would have died without her hands, that every second of delay would have been another milliliter of blood filling his pericardial sac, lived in a space that institutional language couldn't touch. She cleaned out her locker in silence at 1,100 hours. Her shift supervisor, a woman named Patricia who'd been kind without being intrusive, offered to help, but Margaret shook her head. The locker held 3 scrub sets in navy blue, a pair of compression socks with a small hole in the left heel, a photograph of Tom taken 34 years ago in front of Mount Rainier, and a medical reference book with notes in the margin she'd made during night shifts when the ER was quiet. She placed everything in a canvas bag that had once held the weight of her old life, the kind of bag that soldiers use for gear checks. The fluorescent light above her head buzzed, the same sound it had been making for months, nobody's priority. She turned off the light. The locker closed with a click that sounded like finality. The cemetery was in the rain. Margaret didn't remember deciding to go there, only that her car had carried her through traffic on I-10 heading west, past the sprawl of Houston's afternoon suburbs, into the quieter country where Tom had chosen to rest before she was ready to let him. Mud soaked through her shoes, practical leather hospital clogs that had walked 1,000 miles of linoleum, now sinking into wet earth like they belonged there. The gravestone was simple granite, his name and the years in clean sans serif, Thomas Marcus Walsh, 1961 to 2023. She'd buried him 6 months after Tickret broke something inside her that medicine couldn't reach, 6 months after she'd finally understood that coming home wasn't the same as healing. She'd come here often in those first months, standing in the dark, waiting for him to tell her she'd done enough. "I tried to disappear, Tom," she said aloud, her voice barely above the rain. The water ran down her face and she didn't wipe it away. "I tried to be small and invisible and safe. 12 years I've been trying. Took a civilian job, changed my voice, learned to flinch at nothing, learned to accept insults without breaking eye contact. Learned to be forgettable." A car passed on the distant road, its headlights cutting through the grey afternoon. "But I failed you again. Just like I failed that private in Tickret when the IED took his squad leader. Just like I failed every time I stood back and let someone else's arrogance kill good people." She was silent for a long moment. Rain hammered the cemetery like distant artillery. "I saved him, Tom. I saved that Ranger and they're firing me for it. And I don't know if you'd be proud or if you'd think I'm a fool for throwing away the only piece I had left." Her phone rang at 1,347 hours, blocked number. Margaret let it ring twice, then answered because some part of her had been expecting this call, waiting for it like soldiers wait for orders that will change everything. The voice on the other end was military crisp, formal, a woman's voice with the flat effect of someone accustomed to delivering information that couldn't be softened. "Senior Chief Walsh." The rain fell harder. Margaret's hand tightened on the phone. "Commander Sarah Chen, Office of the Secretary of Defense. We've been trying to reach you for 18 hours. Margaret closed her eyes. The rain was cold. The cemetery was spinning slowly. "I haven't been Senior Chief Walsh in 3 years, she said quietly. "We traced a service medal from a classified operation through patient intake at Oak Creek Memorial. Cross-reference with the surgical procedure notes flagged a tactical cardiology intervention, pericardiocentesis, subxiphoid approach, field modification. There are exactly 12 people in the US military trained in that specific protocol. You pioneered it. The commander paused. The rain filled the silence. We need you to confirm your identity. The patient is Army Ranger Michael Cortez, deployed as part of a classified unit. He was carrying commendation documentation that traces back to a joint operation you led in Tikrit in 2019. Margaret's vision blurred. She remembered Cortez, young private then, could barely field strip his weapon, stomach sick during the first medical drill where they practiced cardiac compression on dummies filled with fake blood. She'd trained him herself. She'd watched him grow into a soldier. He made Ranger, she asked, barely whispering. Yes. Third in his selection class. Because of training protocols you developed. The combat cardiology intervention rate in his unit is 34% better than baseline. That's because of you. The commander's voice hardened slightly, became something colder and more certain. We need to bring you in, Senior Chief. You have a classified medical advisory mission assigned effective immediately. You have 36 hours to report to Naval Station San Diego. Margaret looked at her termination letter, the institutional language, the signature that meant she was nobody. Then she looked at Tom's grave, at the rain, at the worn combat boot sitting in her car that she'd kept all these years in a cardboard box under the passenger seat. I don't have a choice, do I? Margaret asked. No, Commander Chen said. You absolutely do. But standing in the rain at your husband's grave on a Tuesday afternoon isn't going to change what happens next. The Pentagon knows what you did. The Pentagon knows who you are. And whether you report or not, that knowledge doesn't go away. Margaret was silent. What happens to Hargrove? She asked. That's not your concern anymore, Senior Chief. It is, Margaret said. It will be. The line was quiet for 3 seconds. Then Commander Chen said, you have 36 hours, and the call ended. Margaret stood in the rain for another 10 minutes, her shoes soaked, her hair plastered against her scalp, her termination letter dissolving to pulp in her jacket pocket. The cemetery stretched around her in grey-green silence, row after row of stones with names carved deep, all the people who'd lived and died and been laid to rest. She thought about invisible service, about the kind of wounds that no uniform could measure, about what it meant to disappear so thoroughly that even the Pentagon had to hunt you down to find you. Tom's stone was cold under her palm. The rain kept falling like it would fall forever. But somewhere in Houston, Dr. Hargrove was still celebrating, still confident that his strategic moves had secured his victory, still certain that the quiet nurse he destroyed would never rise up to challenge him. He had no idea what was about to land in the parking lot of Oak Creek Memorial. The rotor wash shook the windows of Oak Creek Memorial at 6:27 a.m. 2 UH-60M Blackhawks descended into the parking lot with the precision of apex predators settling on prey. Boots hit asphalt. 14 personnel in dress uniforms moved with terrifying fluid efficiency toward the main entrance. The morning shift nurses froze mid-documentation. Someone whispered into the intercom, and the message crackled through every department like electricity through wet wire, command presence in the building. Dr. Hargrove was in the board conference room, still riding the high of Margaret's termination, still confident that his strategic moves had secured complete victory. He was showing the board members his laptop, a presentation titled Institutional Safeguards, Protecting Authority Through Documentation, when the doors opened and a SEAL commander in dress whites walked directly to the head of the table. The commander was 6'3", with shoulders that seemed to take up the doorway's width, and his eyes moved across the room with the calm assessment of someone who'd made life-and-death decisions before breakfast. I'm looking for Senior Chief Petty Officer Margaret Walsh, the commander said. His voice sounded like a tank idling in a garage. By her call sign. Anyone know her? The room went dead silent. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead like they were trying to warn someone. Dr. Hargrove stood up. There's no senior chief here. We have a nurse named Margaret. She was terminated yesterday for scope of practice violations. If this is about that patient. "I don't care about your nurse," the commander interrupted. "Not a request. A statement. I'm looking for Senior Chief Walsh. Decorated Navy personnel. Combat medic. Specialist in field trauma protocols. Ring any bells, Doctor?" Hargrove's face went the color of old bone. The conference room doors burst open again. A Marine Corps captain in dress blues entered, and Margaret's eldest daughter Rebecca didn't just walk, she commanded the space the way her mother moved, the same precise footfalls, the same absolute authority. She was carrying a manila folder stamped "Official Military Personnel File." When she saw her mother being escorted down the hallway by a Pentagon official, Rebecca's jaw clenched, and she turned directly to the board members with the kind of fury that comes from a child who's been searching for her mother for 3 days without answers. "You suspended a senior chief petty officer," Rebecca said. Each word dropped like a hammer. "Without conducting even a basic background check. You're telling me nobody thought to ask who she actually was?" The nurse administrator, Patricia Okonkwo, opened the manila folder with trembling hands. Her eyes scanned the first page, then the second, then the third, and her hands began to shake so badly that Hargrove could hear the paper rustling like wind through trees. Margaret Walsh's service record. 18 years of combat deployments. 3 citations for extraordinary heroism under fire. 1 Bronze Star. 2 Silver Stars. A Navy Cross. Rebecca kept talking, her voice sharp as surgical steel. "My mother served her country for 23 years. She saved 300 lives using combat trauma protocols that she designed. And you," Rebecca pointed directly at Hargrove, "you knocked her tray off a table and threw a patient chart at her feet because you thought she was just a nurse." The SEAL commander stepped in front of Hargrove. The air pressure in the room seemed to change, like the moment before a thunderstorm hits. "Senior Chief Walsh pioneered combat trauma protocols in Tikrit that saved over 300 lives," the commander said. His voice had dropped an octave. "She's being recalled for a classified medical advisory mission, effective immediately. She's not an employee anymore. She's answering to Pentagon command. And if you ever contact her again, if you make a single phone call, send a single email, you will be dealing with JAG Corps prosecution for interference with military personnel. Do you understand me?" Hargrove nodded. He couldn't speak. But the real devastation came that afternoon. Marcus Webb, the IT director, walked into the hospital ethics committee meeting with a laptop and a hard drive. Webb was a Marine Corps veteran himself, Force Recon, 2nd Battalion, and he'd spent the last 48 hours systematically retrieving every file, every camera angle, every timestamp that Hargrove had tried to erase. "This is footage from 0600 on day 1, Marcus said. The conference room watched as Dr. Hargrove deliberately knocked Margaret's breakfast tray to the floor. Coffee spilled across ceramic and scattered eggs across the tile. "This is day 4. Hargrove throwing a patient chart at Margaret's feet in front of 6 medical residents. This is the attempted deletion log. File after file showing Hargrove's systematic attempts to scrub the evidence. Timestamps. Metadata. Everything. I've reported all of this to the State Medical Board," Marcus continued, his voice steady as a surgical laser. "And to hospital ethics. And to the NCIS liaison office, since this involved interference with active military personnel. The Texas Medical Board will have formal proceedings scheduled within the week." The hospital's malpractice insurer had already pulled coverage for Hargrove personally. No legal defense. No institutional protection. The surgical residents had all filed statements confirming that Margaret's pericardiocentesis had been the only intervention that saved the Ranger's life. Hargrove had been in surgery when cardiac tamponade developed. Margaret had acted. The patient survived. 6 other nurses came forward with documented incidents of harassment spanning 3 years. Gendered insults. Deliberate humiliation. Patterns so systematic that the board council recommended immediate suspension pending investigation. Dr. Patricia Chen resigned from the board within an hour, her association with Hargrove now toxic to her own reputation. The other board members who'd backed Hargrove quietly recused themselves. By sunset, he was no longer a doctor at Oak Creek Memorial. His privileges were suspended. His office was being cleared by security. And Margaret Walsh was sitting in a Pentagon briefing room with her daughter Rebecca, a SEAL commander, and 3 classified operations specialists, reviewing mission parameters for her medical recall to Tikrit. "Why didn't you tell us?" Rebecca asked quietly, gripping her mother's hand. Margaret looked at her hands that had held lives together for 18 years. "Because I was ashamed. Because I ran. Because after your father died, I couldn't carry the weight anymore." Rebecca's grip tightened. "You didn't run, Mom. You survived. There's a difference." 6 months later, Margaret stood in a Tikrit medical training facility wearing her Navy uniform again, the senior chief stripes sharp and clean across her chest. She was teaching a new generation of combat medics, 23 personnel, average age 22, all of them recording every word of her pericardiocentesis protocol on laminated handouts marked Classified Medical Advisory. The casualty rate in the current combat medical training program had been 32% higher than the protocol she'd pioneered. Now it was dropping toward 0. Now soldiers were surviving what would have killed them under the old methods. Army Ranger Michael Cortez had recovered completely. His unit was deploying in 72 hours, and before the deployment, he visited the medical facility one last time. He stood at attention in front of Margaret's desk, and he was wearing his service medal, the one she'd found clutched in his unconscious hand at Oak Creek Memorial, pinned to his dress uniform. Beside his bunk stood those worn combat boots, the ones that had been catalogued as patient belongings when he arrived at the hospital unconscious. Now they were polished, ready, standing guard beside the equipment she'd taught him to use. "You trained me as a private, senior chief," Cortez said, saluting formally. "You saved my life as a ranger. I don't have words for that." Margaret returned the salute. Her voice was steady as stone. "You honored the training. That's all any of us can do." Back in Houston, Dr. Hargrove was teaching CPR fundamentals at Houston Community College for minimum wage. His medical license was restricted to non-clinical education only. His career in emergency medicine was over. The state medical board had found him guilty of harassment, evidence tampering, and abuse of authority. Every hospital in Texas had flagged his file. No one would hire him. No one would work with him. Marcus Webb had been promoted to Director of Compliance. The surgical resident Torres finished his residency and requested assignment to a military medical facility, hoping to learn from Senior Chief Walsh directly. Rebecca framed her mother's Navy Cross and hung it in her Marine Corps office with a handwritten note, "You do not need a badge or a gun to be a warrior." Margaret kept a copy of that note in her locker, next to her combat boots, no longer worn, but polished and ready. On her first night back in Tikrit, after the training exercises were complete and the medics had gone to their bunks, she sat alone in the medical tent and looked at a photo of Tom she carried in her pocket. She whispered to the photograph, to the man who'd never gotten to see her remember who she was, "I didn't fail you. I just needed to remember who I was." The rain started outside, hammering the tent like applause. If you've made it this far, you know that quiet strength matters. That the people carrying the heaviest loads are sometimes the ones no one notices. Subscribe, like this video, and tell me in the comments, have you ever been underestimated by someone who didn't know who you really were?